Hi, welcome to another video and thanks for joining me. Now in this video I'd like to ask how the Beatles conquered America and how long did it take? What was the significance of the Ed Sullivan Show performance? And how did America respond to this English invasion and how the Beatles may have influenced American culture, at least from a musical and artistic angle? And then finally, I'd like to look at why the Beatles decided to stop touring after their amazing concerts in America. Right, let's do it. Now, it's often said that it took the Beatles a long time to break into the American market. Well, actually, it took less than a year. Not only did it not take a long time, but Beatlemania struck in an unbelievably short amount of time on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's start at the beginning then. In the UK, Love Me Do was a minor hit in 1962, reaching number 17. Then they recorded the single Please Please Me, and that was November 1962, which was released January 63. And that was a good month and a good year, because that's when I was born. Right, the single raced to number 2 in the record retailer chart, though it made number 1 in the New Musical Express and Melody Maker charts. From Me to You was released April 1963, and it became the first official UK number 1. By this time they were popular, but not quite there yet. Then She Loves You was released August 63, and overnight they became superstars. Parallel to these releases, the Beatles did 4 nationwide tours of the UK. On their February 63 tour, they were bottom of the Billboard artist lists. March 63, they were part of a tour headlined by 2 American artists, who were Tommy Roe and Chris Montez, but the crowd were calling out for the Beatles. In May 63, the tour was initially headlined by Roy Orbison, but the Beatles proved so popular that they were moved to the top of the bill. Now the 4th tour, November 63, just before this tour they returned from 5 days in Sweden, and they were greeted by thousands of fans at Heathrow Airport. And Ed Sullivan was in the UK at the time with his wife, and he was at the airport when the Beatles arrived home, and he got a first-hand experience of what Beatlemania was. Remember Sunday night at the Palladium with Val Parnell? Link up here. The Daily Mirror printed the phrase Beatlemania after that performance on the 13th of October. So while Beatlemania was in full swing in the UK, they were still virtually unknown in America. The initial single released there didn't get much attention. In October 63, stories started appearing in American newspapers about the frenzy in England. A story on Beatles mania appeared on CBS Morning News early the 22nd of November 63. Does that date sound familiar? Well, Beatlemania's story was originally meant to air on the evening news of that day, but it was bumped due to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. On December the 10th, 63, Walter Cronkite, who was looking for some good news to broadcast, aired the story from 18 days earlier. A 15-year-old, Marsha Albert from Silver Springs, Maryland, saw the story on the news. She asked DJ Carol James, "Why can't we have music like that in America?" Excuse my American accent. James had Marsha announce live on air the newest Beatles song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, on December the 17th. Capitol Records would release the single on December the 26th. Now, the first primetime film footage of the Beatles actually aired on the 3rd of January 1964 by Jack Parr. Now, he was an American talk show host, and he played footage of the Beatles concert on his show, and he intended it as a joke, but 30 million people watched it. On January the 25th, I Want to Hold Your Hand hit number 1 on Cashbox, which was one of several music magazines that published record charts in America. The single hit the Billboard Hot 100 on February the 1st. On February the 7th, the CBS Evening News covered the day's arrival of the Beatles in America.
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
2 days later, February the 9th, 73 million television viewers watched the Beatles live on the Ed Sullivan Show. So in a relatively short time, they went from having a growing following in England to conquering America, all within a year. The British invasion of America, as Walter Cronkite had called it, had ended in conquest. 5 Beatles songs were entrenched in the Billboard Hot 100, and their televised performances had broken ratings records. In only 2 weeks, the band had made an indelible mark on American pop culture. Now, it's often said that it wasn't anyone's idea in particular, it was simply the next logical step. Now, the Beatles were very conscious of previous attempts by British musicians to break the US. The biggest British pop star to have tried to make it was Cliff Richard and the Shadows. When the Beatles started out, Cliff was far more famous in the UK than they were. But Cliff and the Shadows had toured the US in 1960 and they got nowhere. Perhaps it was bad timing, perhaps they weren't sufficiently distinctive enough in that by 1960 the first wave of rock and roll had ebbed in the USA, and Cliff and the Shadows, although they were playing sort of bouncy music, it wasn't original, and they weren't exactly the next hot thing. So the Beatles' fame became bigger in the UK during '63. The pressure started on them to consolidate it by going to America. Now, the Beatles had no intention of failing. They noted that Cliff and the Shadows had gone to America without having the benefit of a hit record there. So the Beatles resolved that not only did they want to hit the US charts before risking failure there, they wanted a #1 hit. In the winter of '63-64, they finally got that. After a string of singles had got very little attention, I Want to Hold Your Hand was released 26th of December. The American public seized on it. They eager to be cheered up after having mourned the loss of John F. Kennedy, and it sold 250,000 copies in the first 3 days. That's right, 250,000 copies in 3 days. It reached #1 on the 1st of February '64. Now, George Martin recalled being woken in the middle of the night by a call from Brian Epstein telling him the record had reached #1 in America, and he invited him and his partner Judy Lockhart-Smith around for a celebratory drink. They got up, got dressed, headed over to Brian's house for what would end up being an all-night party. The USA was in Beatles fever, and by the time the Beatles landed in New York a week later, they were the big news story. Well, on a fundamental level, it could be argued that the Beatles were so popular simply because their songs sold well, especially their early material. From the perspective of an art historian or a critic, one could argue that the Beatles were the natural evolution of rock and roll, a lineage that had started with Elvis Presley. So how did the Beatles and the British invasion change American music? Well, the British invasion would unleash a creative musical explosion in America in the mid-60s. Guitar sales soared, longer hair in young men became instantly popular, and the British flag even became a fashion statement. Rule Britannia. But the Beatles had the quirks of an entire industry standing behind them and an enormous American market. You have to remember that there was very little exchange between the music scenes in Britain and America. The US charts were compiled kind of haphazardly across metamorphic areas, making it even harder for the word to spread about a band making waves across the pond. So up until '63, the Beatles' music was being issued in the United States on second and third tier labels. Their initial US singles were released on VJ Records, and they were sent to blues, jazz and soul DJs, not to pop music stations. So the Beatles didn't stand a chance in America without kind of a big push budget distribution and promotion of a mainstream label. That finally changed when Capitol Records decided to throw its weight behind a full-scale Beatles release in America, and that was with the album Meet the Beatles, which they issued on the 20th of January 64. On the 24th of January, I Want to Hold Your Hand had reached #1 in the US charts. Now, if the band was still having doubts about breaking through to the American audiences, then the 4,000 young fans awaiting their arrival at New York's JFK airport, the ratings, smashing appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, and successful stops at Washington, New York, and Florida should have dispelled those concerns. Now, Ringo reportedly said when he stepped off the plane at JFK airport, "So this is America? They must be out of their minds." Liverpool accent. Elijah Wald, an American writer and author of a number of books, including How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, said it justified their belief that they were major. Every British rock and roll band before the Beatles had been considered just an imitation of American music. When they came to America, they were treated like the biggest thing in rock and roll. That changed not only their own perception of themselves, as well as changing everybody else's perception of them. The legacy of the Beatles' trip to America was, first and foremost, that they had succeeded where other British pop stars had failed. But the uniqueness of their talents and of American social setting in '64 was certainly helpful. It was a helpful combination. Let's break down those factors in a little more detail then. The talent, the producer, the manager, the audience, and the timing. So with the talent, quite apart from Ringo's minimal writing contributions, between John, Paul and George, there were 3 great songwriters in one band, which was kind of somewhat of a rarity, therefore producing many, many timeless tunes. And the primary songwriting duo, Lennon and McCartney, who formed that magical dark and light team to generalise Paul writing the lighter stuff, John writing the darker. We had the producer, George Martin, a brilliant, innovative and experimental guy. The manager, of course, Brian Epstein, who loved the lads, and he was dedicated and ambitious. There was the audience, 75 million baby boomers coming into their own with money in their pockets right at the time that the Beatles hit the American scene. American youth at the time weren't that crazy about 50s pop scene. They wanted and were ready for, even if they didn't realise it, their own music. Then we have the timing. All important factor, timing. In '64, America was sliding into chaos. The Vietnam War, the resulting appearance of kind of hippiedom, and in '64 there was the precipice of the fast developing youth culture that was crying out for something of our own and rejecting the conventions of the past or their parents' generation. An important aspect that was that they wanted to have their own music, and the Beatles brought that to them. Well, it was Sid Bernstein. Now, he helped usher in pop music's British invasion by bringing the Beatles to New York City for history-making concerts at Carnegie Hall and Shea Stadium. Sid had been telephoning Brian Epstein persistently since March 1963, proposing the band play the Carnegie Hall in New York. Now, the Beatles were nervous about coming to America. A solo trip to Illinois in September '63 had George worrying that the American crossover was going to be hard. Paul was sceptical even on the flight over, fretting, they've got their own groups. What are we going to give them that they don't already have? And even John Lennon had his own doubts too. On the plane over, he was thinking, oh, we won't make it. But in addition to their sound, musical historians also say that their timing was part of what allowed the Beatles to break through. Right place, right time. Now, the Beatles' February the 9th, 1964 performance on The Ed Sullivan Show set TV records. An estimated 73 million Americans tuned in to their performance, which played to 45% of homes with televisions in America at the time. They would play the Ed Sullivan Show again at the end of their February tour and returned for another series of stateside concerts in August. And they would sell more than 1 million copies of each of their 9 US singles and 6 LPs, adding up to 25 million Beatles records sold in total in America that year alone. It's interesting to note that Ray Bloch, who was the Ed Sullivan Show's musical director, wasn't impressed. When asked for a comment about the performance by a reporter from the New York Times, he was blunt. The only thing that's different is the hair. As far as I can see, I give them a year. Oh, the naysayers. You've got to believe. But it wasn't just their music that made the Beatles so appealing. It was the kind of the way that they carried themselves, their mop-top haircuts, the clean-cut suits, and the way that they interacted with the media. They kind of blended a smart-alecky intelligence with a playful, rebellious streak that was present from their kind of very first press conference at the JFK airport.
Could you please sing something?
No! Sorry.
Next question. It turns out that you can sing.
No, we need money first.
And of course, their British accents didn't hurt either. Now, some Americans love a British accent. I was in North Carolina once in a store, and I asked an assistant about some music that I was I heard playing, and if she knew who the artist was, and she didn't answer me. So I asked her again, and she apologised, and she said she just wanted to hear me ask again because of my accent. Excuse me, love, what's that music playing? Oh, yeah. To further endorse their conquering of America, Brian had a rigorous tour schedule mapped out. For the US tour of Winter '64, and that was the month of February, they played New York 3 times, Washington DC, and Miami. So that was the Ed Sullivan Show, the DC Coliseum, and Carnegie Hall. For the summer of '64, it was a United States and Canada tour from August the 19th to the 20th of September. They played Daly City, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Seattle, Los Angeles, Denver, Cincinnati, 3 times in New York, Atlantic City, Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Jacksonville, Boston, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, New Orleans, Kansas City, Dallas, and even across the border over into Canada with Toronto, Montreal and Vancouver. I can now see why they were worn out from touring. That was rigorous, especially with the screaming fans drowning out their kind of pitiful lamps and their PAs. By the time they toured America in '65, they were, well, the biggest thing since sliced bread. So the '65 tour was from the 15th to the 31st of August, and they played New York, Toronto, Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, Minneapolis, Portland, San Diego, twice at Los Angeles Hollywood Bowl, and 2 shows at Cow Palace in Dale City in San Francisco. The lads, of course, performed their biggest concert at Shea Stadium to a crowd of 55,000 screaming fans, and we all know how that went down, right? Can't hear a thing. Their final tour of America happened in summer 1966, and that was from the 12th to the 29th of August. And there they played Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Washington, DC, of course, Philadelphia, Toronto, Boston, Memphis, Cincinnati, St. Louis, New York City, Seattle, Los Angeles and San Francisco. Now, for that last concert of August 29th, '66, the Beatles arrived in San Francisco to wrap up their summer tour with a show at Candlestick Park. Now, what might at first have seemed like an unexceptional event actually signalled the end of an era, as they had all agreed this would be their final concert. Now, Ringo said, "There was a big talk at Candlestick Park that this had got to end. At that San Francisco gig, it seemed that this could possibly be the last time, but I never felt 100% certain till we got back to London. John wanted to give up more than the others. He said that he'd had enough. The Beatles never formally gave up touring. They simply played the last contracted concert of their 1966 world tour in San Francisco and didn't actually arrange any more dates. Over the course of their tenure as a band, they led the way in production techniques, kind of with their transition from a gigging pop group to a band that could create album-orientated rock. It's almost like they became the thinking person's band. You know, I might even think that they bordered on prog rock with things like A Day in the Life or Strawberry Fields, you know, telling stories in their songs. Let me know what you think in the comments. Were they a prog rock band? They certainly pioneered music videos, and they also transformed attitudes about mind-altering drugs, as well as ushering in a new interest in non-Western religions. So their success in the US changed not only their perception of themselves, it changed everybody else's perception of them. The Beatles conquered America with the backing of a great team, a money-making record label, and potentially being in the right place at the right time. The Beatles did in fact conquer America, and the effects of the conquest, I think, are still felt today. So that's it for now. You know, I think the Beatles did take America, and people are still in adoration of all four of them, and we still have Paul touring. I don't know, maybe he'll stop now. Ringo's done his tour, but he's had to cancel because of illness on a number of occasions. But yeah, they were in the right place at the right time, and it just happened. Remember what I said about Paul and his kind of vibe about being lucky. So I think, you know, let's go for it. Let's do it. Let's see what will happen. So that's my take on the Beatles and how they conquered America. I'll say thanks for watching and bearing with, and I'll see you in another video. Bye for now.